Hello, I'm Dominic Hobson. My guest today is Chris Freeman, a former head of operations at Aviva Investors, Nomura Asset Management and Royal London Asset Management, who is now consulting to custodian banks on operational issues. Our subject matter is operational resilience. Chris, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Now, both of us remember the Financial Conduct Authority raising operational resilience as an issue for asset managers who had outsourced to global custodian banks back in 2012, 2013. How did the industry handle the request from the FCA? How did they handle the problem then?
Well, I think that the main thing was looking at the operational resilience and investigating how you would move your operational function should there be some form of systemic event. So there was a lot of focus around that and understanding how companies were set up and how they outsourced various aspects of their operational function, and begin to understand that more.
If memory serves, that the major asset managers and the major global custodians set up a group to respond to this and said, well, actually, it's not, the risks isn't as great as you think it is. Is my memory at fault, or is that your memory as well?
Yeah, that's my memory as well. I'd say that there was, there's two trains of thought on that. I think that actually there is a risk there, and I think there's a degree of looking at it very much as how do we mitigate that risk, and then looking at it and saying, well, actually, if those areas, that risk won't happen, or we don't want to go quite as far as the FCA were initially proposing, and there was a middle ground, because there's obviously a cost element to all of this. I think there was a bit of push and pull there as to, well, how far do we want to go?
But the issue went away for at least a few years. And then we had this fresh consultation by the FCA and the Bank of England, which closed a couple of months ago now, 1st of October. Why did it come back to life, and what was new in this consultation?
Well, I think to the point I made earlier, I think there was a degree of, as you say, there was a feeling that it wasn't as severe. The impact wouldn't be as severe as people made out. But I think there is a realization that actually it could be. And if you look at some of the papers that are written back in 2012, the OSCO paper, etc., where they looked at it in quite depth as to what systemic events could actually happen, there is actually quite a degree of risk there that probably isn't necessarily appreciated through organisations. So I think that it is something that will come back, because obviously how the industry is expanded and the complexity of it has got larger, and as we're more reliant on systems, therefore the impact of an event impacting those is much higher. So that's why I think it's come back.
The funny thing is, the ironic thing is, I suppose, that during this consultation period, we've actually had a systemic event in the shape of COVID-19. Yeah. What did that teach us about operational risk and operational resilience? Suddenly you've got everybody working at home, trying to do crucial back and middle office operations without being in the office. What have you been surprised by how resilient the system has proved, or do you think it's taught us some worrying lessons about what doesn't work well?
I think in the early stages, I think it taught us some lessons. I think it's actually worked quite well in the longer term. I think the initial experience, some organisations took longer to get up to speed with their remote working. So a lot of companies had limitations on how many people could work at the same time on the systems. But on the plus side, I think a lot of people got up to speed with that, addressed their bandwidth issues, brought on additional servers and different ways of doing things, so that that bandwidth expanded relatively quickly. But just goes to show that you can't make assumptions about what's going to happen, and that you need that backup within your infrastructure, or at least the ability to expand it.
But trades have been settled and entitlements have been collected throughout this period. So it was a kind of a test with live ammunition of people's operational resilience. And on the whole, would you say that people came through it pretty cleanly?
Yes, I would. I think it was, and to a certain extent, going back to your point earlier, there's a systemic event that happens. There was probably small hiccups in the initial stages, but actually the system resilience has been pretty impressive.
So do we know when this consultation by the bank is going to be published, or their findings will be published next year sometime, presumably? Do you have any idea what the timetable is?
I think by the looks of it, they're not I couldn't see the exact date of when they're going to publish, but they're not expecting the implementation to be until the back end of next year. Uh-huh. So there's a reasonable distance. But I think they didn't want to put pressure on companies because of COVID and budget constraints.
Yeah. Anyway, we've talked a lot so far about purely operational resilience, but one of the things I noticed about this latest FCA consultation is that there is a customer service and investor protection component to it, which wasn't necessarily there back in 2012-13, when the anxiety was a custodian bank would fall over, and then billions, tens of billions of assets would be wandering around the market looking for a home, and obviously that would put investors at risk through the asset management client. But there seems to be a much tighter focus this time on customer service, investor protection. What would you suggest that regulated firms should be doing about that?
So there's more around, if you do have those events, what is the ultimate impact to your client base? And this is where I think it's probably dropped down a level. So rather than looking at the big events, the smaller events that can happen to an organization, they're not necessarily a systemic event for the industry, but more an event that happens to an individual company or an individual relationship with an outsourcer that impacts that client base, and how that's protected. So, if the systems are down for a few days, or and that's impacting the client's ability to process their transactions or pass their transactions or access their cash, then obviously that's a big client impact. So I think that's where the driver's coming from, and there's obviously been events in the market which has focused more on the impact to clients.
Something else that's changed since 2012, 2013 is the senior managers regime has come in, which means that senior managers of these organizations are going to be held personally responsible for these operational shortcomings and face fines and possibly even jail terms. Do you detect from the clients that you're talking to that's really changed attitudes towards this issue?
I think it is. I think it is slowly changing. I don't think it's going to be an overnight change. I think there's probably an education piece to be had with that senior management regime. If you've not worked in operations, there isn't necessarily that understanding that it's either working or it's not. There's no middle ground, so it's understanding quite how close you are to it not working. It's that operational resilience piece, but quantified. So where are you operationally? Are you always just getting things done? Is it always just in time? Is it only just working? Is it key man dependency that gets you through the day? And if that person's not around, is that what's causing you the issue? Or have you got some old legacy systems that fall over on a regular basis? So it's understanding all of that piece, and what impact that has on your business, either if it's outsourced or internal, and what impact, to your point just now, what impact does that have on your client base? Mm-hmm. Because that's probably where you're going to hit the client more than you are going to hit problems with your outsourcer, etc.
Mm-hmm. So, if I'm a senior manager, I probably in recent years been thinking, well, this is great. So I can outsource or offshore my settlement, my custody, my fund accounting, my transfer agency, and you're not really thinking necessarily about what happens if the transfer agent systems go down or we can't crack a NAV on time. Yeah. And one of the things that I think I'm hearing you say is that back inside the regulated firm, there isn't necessarily the experience and knowledge of what to do about that when it actually happens. In a way, people have kind of offshored and outsourced the tacit knowledge they have to run operations. Is that a fair assessment?
I think it is. If you look at if you're sitting there and you've outsourced everything, and it may have been outsourced 5, 10, 15 years ago, and you've outsourced your custody, your transfer agency, your fund accounting, your pricing, etc. Yeah, that's now all at arm's length. And then within those organisations, it's within black boxes within those organisations. So actually understanding what your operating model is and what happens if something goes wrong is actually quite difficult for anybody actually to understand. So for argument's sake, if you're publishing your prices from your TA and they're always going out late, well, what's the cause of that? Do you go and bang on the TA's door saying, hold on a minute, your processes aren't good enough? And then TA goes, well, hold on a minute, I'm getting them late from fund accounting, your fund accountant. So you go and see your fund accountant, and then all of a sudden you've got to go back through the entire process to find out that actually my price feed's coming in late every day, and that's impacting the issue of prices. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot to understand in that operating model. Plus, you might have outsourced it across different providers as well.
Yes, almost everybody has more than one TA and more than one fund accountant, and often more than one custodian. So complexity is multiplied, I guess, across providers and jurisdictions.
Yeah.
Now, another thing that's changed since we last had a serious visit from the regulator on this issue back in 2012, 2013, is back then, outsourcing was basically the custodian would come along and lift out your entire back and middle office, put it onto their platform, in theory anyway, if not in practice. And so you literally, you were in a closed architecture. And you were on their platforms and they were in charge, and they liked it that way, and you hadn't possibly thought through how risky that was. Now we're moving towards a more open architecture. State Street is the most obvious instance of an organization that's gone in that direction with its alpha platform. So you can work with whatever systems you prefer, what order management, portfolio management systems you like. Now, do you think that approach reduces operational risk, or do you think it possibly increases it?
Probably a bit of both, because obviously, you've got control. So you've selected that provider, so you've got control over that. You know what you've purchased. You've got somebody else operating it. I think where the challenge comes is if you've got somebody operating your systems, and they take on other providers which have got different systems. where do you get that synergy? Where do you get that, as you want to improve things, where do you stand in the pecking order of being able to make those improvements against other clients on that platform? And you don't get the benefit of that group development. So if one client's got a problem and they're on one system, and you've got another client that's got a similar problem but they're on a different system, you've not got that benefit of that cost advantage of when the supplier does the development, they do it for all clients, so spreads the load and the cost. So there's some pros and cons there I can see, and it would very much depend on the relationship between the investment house and the provider as to how well that works.
Now, you said a minute ago that one reason the FCA and the Bank of England are not pushing aggressively on the consequences of the consultation they've run this year is because they don't want to. They recognise there are cost pressures as a result of the pandemic and so on.
Yeah.
But if you were, as you are, advising organisations in this area, clearly some investment needs to go into operational resilience. Is it possible that there is a kind of return? Can you make out a case for investing in operational resilience on grounds that there is a return on operational investments, or is this just all risk reducing cost?
I think there is. I think that the more you're resilient and your systems function and talk to one another, and you understand that architecture and the ability to change, I think that's an area that gets overlooked quite a lot when we talk about this. As you make those improvements and you understand your operating model in detail, that actually improves your operational resilience, but it also improves your operational performance as well. So you become effective and efficient by making those improvements. And I think that's where the benefit lies. The more you can streamline processes, make it resilient, understand it, then as you progress down that route, I think you'll get a payback from the savings you make in either cost reduction because you don't need quite so many staff, operational efficiency because you can pump more through it. So you're making those improvements.
Is there ever a case for a wholesale change of your technology platforms? And I guess the reason I ask you that is because there are clearly operational risks in continuing to patch up existing legacy systems, and adding bits to them and pulling a bit out here causes effects over there and so on. But at the same time, if you were to say, well, actually, this fintech from Shoreditch has persuaded us that if we throw away all our existing systems and move on to this new platform, we're going to massively reduce our costs and reduce our risks and make ourselves more resilient. Where do you stand on that spectrum? What part is digital technology playing in reducing, modern digital technology playing in reducing or increasing operational risk and resilience?
I think at the individual system level, an awful lot. So they as you said when we were discussing earlier, on COVID, we couldn't have done what we've done this year, even probably 5 years ago. We wouldn't have had that bandwidth to be able to do that. So I think there's been a huge advance in the technology and the robustness of technology to run organisations. I think the challenge is, if you wanted to make a wholesale change, is how you would go about it. So how would you untangle your current system architecture to move on to one central platform. Plus, you're putting all your eggs in one basket as well. So you've got to balance up that risk, and who would be the first mover? So that first mover advantage, or is that actually first mover? Actually, the industry's just sitting there waiting to pick up the pieces because it doesn't work. So I think it's quite a risky proposition. It would have to be very, very robust and very tested. I think for any corporation to select that.
Nobody wants to be the next TSB.
No. Yeah.
But on the other hand, it seems an attractive option to build a whole new platform which reduces the marginal cost of what you're doing significantly, and then gradually migrate the clients onto it. But I guess the TSB experience has put the kibosh on that for the foreseeable future anyway.
Yeah, and something I raised years ago. I always made this comment. I'm back from the old school days of the London Stock Exchange and the CSP and looking at that model. And I'm not suggesting we go back to the old school, but what I'm saying is it was almost you had these central utilities, and if we wanted to remove cost and risk and actually spread that risk, if you took something like fund accounting, and my analogy there is if you go and take a flight to Edinburgh once you're allowed to fly again, and stand in the Gyle and look around, you've got the likes of HSBC and JP Morgan, etc. And they all do the same thing in exactly the same way to exactly the same standards and exactly the same set of regulations. If we wanted to remove cost and risk, we'll just make it a utility and produce it once. And I get a lot of pushback on that of people saying, well, my fund's different, but most funds, you cut a NAV, that's it. It's as simple as that. So there are different options that could be looked at to remove risk in different ways. It doesn't always have to be one organization somehow winning the technology battle. There's probably some other options out there.
Centralized utility versus distributed services is a sort of a very live debate these days, or since blockchain came along anyway.
Yeah.
The view is that you have no single point of failure anymore because everybody has a copy of the same thing and it's on dozens of nodes across this network, as opposed to all your eggs being in one basket and guarding the basket very carefully. Have your views changed as a result of distributed financial technology or not?
I don't know. What would you give as an example of that?
I'm thinking that if you had a single utility, for example, doing fund accounting for JP Morgan, HSBC, and so on, but instead of doing it in one centralized platform, these things the exercise was repeated continuously across multiple platforms. So everybody had a copy of the NAV. So if one of these nodes fell over, we still had the NAV, and you'd never be short of something to publish in the newspaper.
Yeah, I think that would potentially work. It's just whether that duplication gives you the sort of operational efficiency that you're looking for from a cost point of view. So does that duplication come at a cost? And can you minimize that?
Well, you face the question whether it's being to be done fast enough as well.
Yeah,
that's the other issue. Just one final question, Chris. Just looking at everything you've worked on over the last 20 years, for example, what do you think is, and you've been very eloquent about how the Covid-19 experience has actually been quite encouraging. It shows that we have made some progress in operational resilience even over the last 5 years. But what do you think what would be your prediction as the biggest operational risk which firms face now?
I think it is actually people. and the knowledge. We touched on it earlier on the senior management regime. If something goes wrong, who do you rely on? Who actually understands that overall operational process? And I think for people coming into the industry straight from university, I think it's very difficult for those people to actually get a good grounding on how the end-to-end process works, because it's either, we went through the outsourcing, we outsourced to Dublin, then we outsourced, then it moved to Poland, and then it moved to India, and I think some has even come back, and there's a bit of Chinese whispers in there as it goes through, how much knowledge gets lost. And then because everything is a black box and technology is as good as it is, there's very little visibility on how anything actually works. And then the way organizations are structured, both from the investment side and the operational suppliers, everything's salami sliced. So every process is only you only actually focus on a very slim area of that process. So nobody actually has the full picture. And I think there needs to be some more investment in those younger people coming in to how do we train them up so that they actually understand how every component works. And I've seen things happen. One organisation, for argument's sake, it was a private equity trade, and nobody knew when they'd executed the trade even, and that hadn't even touched the system yet. They hadn't realised that when they signed the application form, they'd entered a trade, not at the point the first drawdown was done. So we've got to build that knowledge up and that understanding of how things work. And to my earlier example of the sort of the TA issue in the price, how many people in your organisation actually understand that process? Or even something even more straightforward. If you went into an organisation and said, broker executes a trade or investment manager executes a trade, tell me how it gets from them through custody, through the CSD, how's it matched, and how's the reconciliation done? I think at the moment you'd find that very difficult to find that many people that could actually explain it to you, which is maybe 20 years ago you wouldn't have had any problem. So I think that's where we've got that disconnect.
Mm-hmm. And I guess not everyone who's running a global custodian bank has ever settled a trade, actually, which was maybe 20, 25, 30 years ago. Most people had. They'd come up and understood the business in immense detail like that. I'm not sure how we fix that, Chris, but perhaps you'll never be able to retire. That's the only answer. You'll be mentor to generations of new entrants into the industry for the next 30 years. So I hope you've got lots of energy left. But thank you very much for joining us. It's been a great discussion, and see you very soon, I hope.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.